Good evening, El Paso. Welcome to Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera, where we share the fun of the big questions with you. My name is Jared Mendy, and I'm an EPCC UTEP Humanities Collaborative Fellow, and today we're honored to have Dr. Iva Ivanova with us.
Hi, everyone.
Dr. Ivanova is a professor at the Department of Psychology at UTEP. She graduated with a PhD in Cognitive Science and Language from the University of Barcelona in 2010. Her research aims to advance the understanding of how people produce, comprehend, and communicate through language, with a special focus on bilingual individuals. She was born in Bulgaria and speaks over 5 languages, including Bulgarian, English, Spanish, Catalan, and German. Thank you so much for coming, Dr. Ivanova. We're really glad to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really exciting for me.
So I think we're going to just jump into the questions. The first question I wanted to ask, we're going to talk about the aesthetics of language and how that plays a role in communication. And so would you say that there's an aesthetic element to language?
Absolutely. And there's an aesthetic element at several different levels. So perhaps the thing that we think most often about when we talk about aesthetics and language is how words sound, or sort of the musical quality. This is sometimes referred to as euphonics. The quality of sounds, it's come from a Greek word, and it's a quality of sounds to sound pleasant.
Yeah.
And this kind of thing is used a lot in poetry. For example, it's considered that it sounds more pleasant when you have alliteration, even though that can have also the opposite effect. It basically depends on the sound, but you repeat certain, so you repeat words that start maybe with a particular sound. Now, I also, one interesting fact that I wanted to mention is that our perception of what is pleasant is not independent of how easy it is for us to say or understand it. And so, and this is what is referred to in linguistics with euphonics. So words and sounds and sequences of sounds that are easier to say, and I'll give you a concrete example, are considered to be, because they're easier. So perhaps that can be related to our perception of the fact that we perceive them as pleasant. And just as an example, I was thinking of the word ninfa in Spanish. And this is also interesting how it can vary, because in English, this word has an M, so nymph with an M and an F. But in Spanish, it combines the N and F, and that's because they're produced in a more similar way. And what I mean by this is that the tongue touches the palate with an N and a F. And they're closer to each other than an M and an F. And so that is something that can perhaps drive our perceptions. Another aspect of what can be pleasant, so what can be aesthetic in language is visual imagery, so things like metaphor and the capacity to which language can be used to create perhaps a richer image or a more subtle image. And this is also something that we do very, very often when we speak. And then a final aspect that I wanted to mention is the rhythmical, and that probably is not exhaustive either, but the rhythmical properties of language. And here, again, interestingly, it's related to ease of processing. So we know that it's easier to understand things that are sort of, that work in parallel, that are symmetrical. And so, and that's perhaps also used by poetry with the metered expression, and so this quality of the rhythmical properties of language is also used in rhetoric and perhaps in writing, where it's not just poetry. I mean, it's just prose, where it's actually more. You have more time to think about what you say.
Yeah. So would you say, because you said there's a connection between the pleasure that hearing a word and how easy it is to speak it. Would you say that words that are harder to say are less pleasant, maybe generally?
I would say so. I think that it is not. We cannot fully separate the ease from the aesthetic. Now there are other things that make up aesthetics, as I was just saying. Also, one other aspect of what creates aesthetics. So aesthetics are not devoid, and perhaps metaphor comes into it, but they're not completely separable from meaning, and so which might so how meaning is expressed might differ across languages, but let's say we would have something like words that start with "s," and if you have several words as in a poetic device, alliteration, that can maybe be evocative of a snake, right? Because the word snake in English starts with those same letters, and so there are other things. But I think ease is in general, people like things that are easier, and this is called fluency of processing, as we call it.
That's awesome. That's really interesting to hear, actually. And that I was going to ask, and I think we can still explore this, is how the aesthetic element of a spoken word influences what is being communicated. And I think you talked about that because you were saying that the more pleasant it is to speak and the more pleasant it is to hear, it increases that aesthetic element. And I wonder if that's would you say that helps what is being communicated become clearer, or is that not necessarily the case?
So traditionally, and this is the science called psycholinguistics, which is kind of the psychological processes that underlie, that drive linguistic expression. So this is my core discipline. So traditionally, the factors that we talk about, the things that we know determine what you say and how you say what you say. Aesthetics is not the first one to be mentioned there, but I think it kind of all ties together with that ease of expression. So we wouldn't say that aesthetics per se, perhaps interestingly, and perhaps clearly more research needs to be done. But the two primary determinants of spoken communication, and when I say spoken, I also mean sign languages, not just spoken languages, but oral communication, I should say. So one is what is most available in your mind at the moment. And we talk about this in terms of activation of mental representation, and this is just nerd speak of saying that how available or prominent something is in your mind. And we do have some subjective experience of this. Something naturally comes to mind, and some other words don't come to mind as often. And sometimes we have words that are on the tip of our tongue, so we kind of know what we want to say, except the actual words, the actual form of what we want to say is not available. So this is one of the primary determinants of that shapes which precise words we use in order to express ourselves. And so now we can make the argument that words that are more frequent and words, so this also ties in with the easier words are more frequent, and that perhaps subconsciously might be the ones that we might perceive as more aesthetic sometimes. Those are the ones that come to mind more frequently. Another major thing that determines why we say the precise words, and this is big, is taking into account what our listeners know. And so, when I say listener, I mean in a spontaneous conversation, so just the person that you're talking to. And this is called audience design. And again, this doesn't need to be an audience. This is just whoever you're speaking to, your conversation partner, and so you really scale what you say to the knowledge of your conversation partner. And so perhaps a very obvious example is would like what I say to be accessible and comprehensible to a large number of people, and so I try to very carefully choose my words today. But that would be very different from how I talk about certain things with my colleagues who are in this field, and they perhaps know the specialized vocabulary that we use to talk about this, or even a simpler example, kind of like some people would refer to me as Iva, other people as Dr. Ivanova, other people as maybe the tall Bulgarian or something like that. So you really take into account the knowledge of your conversation partner with some with some, I want to say, constraints, as in this does require some kind of more thinking, it requires a little bit more effort, and so perhaps if you're tired, at the end of the day, you maybe do this a little bit less than when you're more alert and have more energy. So what does this have to do with aesthetics? So I want to say, and again, this is a topic that needs to be more researched, but I want to say that aesthetics ties into ease of processing a little bit. And one other thing that I also wanted to mention is, it's perhaps not a primary determinant of what you say, but another kind of factor that shapes how we say what we say is that we do at times mimic. We reuse words from the person we are speaking with. We sometimes kind of mimic rhythmical properties of maybe their intonation. Kind of we fall in sync. One of the terms for this is entrainment, and this is one of the major research lines in my laboratory. So I'm very excited about this phenomenon, and so in a sense you can say that so there are two things. One is how you say what you say is at times only product of your own mind, but you're syncing with another person's mind.
Interesting.
And the other is that aesthetics may come into this in the form of rhythm, so that you kind of you really fall. When I say you fall in sync, it's even not only purely oral expression, but also body language. And this aspect is something that one of my colleagues, Stephanie Borey at Utah State, studies, and she has this video when you see, two people, like you really, like it's almost some kind of a dance, and it's a spontaneous conversation by two strangers, people who never met before. So this is something that happens, and I find quite interesting.
That is really interesting. What got you into entrainment? What did you think that was like something that, like a big question about that you wanted to ask?
Perhaps not such an interesting answer to this is that I read an article that was suggested by my graduate advisor at the time, and this is an article that was published in 2004, and I remember I read it before it came out, in a sense. And so this is like. And this was a time that I did not have a lot of experience with science in general, I dare say, and it was just absolutely exciting to me. Like, I am getting to read this before it has even reached the public, And so I also, here a detour is that I wanted to mention I majored in British and American studies in Sofia, Bulgaria, and I really, really enjoyed it. But I also felt like basically I was reading stuff written by people like at least 100 years ago. This was, and so to me it's like, oh wow, these are my contemporaries. They're people that are still alive, and it's not even that, but this hasn't even been published yet. And so I thought, like, this is the cutting edge. This is science. So that was really exciting. But I could also see at the time this was an article that was proposing kind of a larger theoretical model about how we sync up in a conversation that was combining things, so it wasn't trivial in a sense. It was combining things from different areas to produce within the language sciences like a theoretical proposal of how we do this. And theoretical proposal is the beginning of things, not the end. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done. Kind of like, and I've been thinking about this a lot. So I'm realizing there's a lot more that we don't understand about this phenomenon, or these multiple phenomena that are perhaps related. But I think in general, there's also a personal element to this, which is, I refer jokingly to myself as an armchair philosopher, but I love conversation. I love exchange of ideas, and how learning and of course you can read something from written. You can learn things from written language, but conversation is something dynamic, and it can completely change your worldview. And so, kind of like truth is born. Whatever I mean by that. I take this with a pinch of salt, but whatever I mean by truth, but. It's kind of born in conversation. So I'm personally fascinated with dialogue, and I think that's perhaps feeds into my desire to study more about this.
That's really awesome. That's super exciting. And I mean, we are being armchair philosophers right now. So
that is exactly
literally
armchair
exactly
philosophers. Right. Yeah, and one other thing that ties into that is I'm also interested in dance and in partner dancing. I dance Argentine tango as a hobby, and it's I promise I won't spend I can spend hours talking about this, which I won't do right now. But it's another form of coordinated rhythmical behavior that I feel can enrich our perspective also of what we do with language.
I mean, that's a really interesting thing to touch on, because it's almost like you can think of dance as this kind of more constructed form of behavioral mimicking and rhythm and the behavior. In the same way, you can think of a lot of music as kind of a more constructed form of just speech, or poetry. Probably poetry more. But it's it's not, we didn't take something that was totally arbitrary and not in any way structured and just make structure. We took something that was a little bit structured or had a really kind of complicated, nuanced structure, and we put a different kind of structure on it. So poetry is you take speech and then you constrain it more than it normally is constrained. But it still has a kind of rhythmic constraint normally.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. This is older and deeper than just language. And I recently read a very interesting and fascinating to me paper about how this language behavior and this language entrainment, right, as they call it, this syncing up to the other person, is related to rhythm perception. And so in a sense, you have to be able to perceive the rhythm, and you have to be able to yourself produce rhythmical behavior, and you have to be able to connect the two so that you can change yours based on the perception of the others. And they were pointing out that these are kind of evolutionary old behavior. It's not even about humans. Animals, a lot of animal species show rhythmical behavior, but even within human kind of activities and physiology, you can think walking is a rhythmical behavior, breathing is a rhythmical behavior. Then you can think these kind of recurrent, so on a much larger scale, but the day and the night, the seasons, there's some rhythmical behavior. So human in general, and that again ties to the aesthetic. Humans like rhythm. It makes it, it's a natural thing, and it also makes it easier to perceive.
That's a fascinating kind of question that I think we could spend hours on. Because wow, there's so much about humanity that's rhythmic. I'm gonna shift conversations, unfortunately, but so as a polyglot, you know a number of languages, and fluent in a number of languages, and there's something that I wanted to kind of explore in relation to the aesthetic quality of words, is that some words sound better suited for their like meaning, and like across like different languages, it's like a word in one language will sound almost closer to what it's supposed to mean than a word in another language. So like I think like example for me is like cruje in Spanish is like creek in English, and I think cruje sounds better for it because the creaking is in the word itself. It's like cruje, right? But then in English there's also this kind of using words not in like an onomatopoeia, but like the sound itself imitates what it's supposed to mean. And so like in English there's like SL sounds at the start of a word often often denote like a frictionless motion. So like slip, slide, slime, slow, sloth, you know. And the sound itself has a frictionless motion. I was thinking about like knowing different languages. Do you think that that's the case, that like some words sound better suited for their meaning, or do you think it's more based on like the context or like how someone grew up, the languages that they spoke?
So there's a lot to this question.
Yeah.
And I guess I should first talk about the kind of arbitrariness versus like I wanted to unpack onomatopoeia for the viewers, but so traditionally, like historically, there's the Swiss linguist in the late part of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, Ferdinand de Saussure, who was talking about linguistic sign, and then there's a kind of a signifier and a signified. So a sign, so all language is ultimately signs, and it has a meaning and a form. And one of the sort of tenets of what he was saying is that the relationship is purely arbitrary for the most part. There is nothing that connects a word to its meaning. And this was also, there are several other people that have taken up that idea. One is American linguist Charles Hockett, who was talking about design principles of language. And one of those design principles, he was pointing out that it's arbitrariness. And so part of it can be intuitive, right? Like the word, even if you take several languages, the word dog and the word perro, the sounds are like almost completely different. There's nothing, Bulgarian is kuche, so completely different sounds to express the same meaning. And so if you thought, well, there's something in that thing that drives a certain sound, then you wouldn't have such different sounding words across languages. And this is true to some extent. However, first we have onomatopoeia. And onomatopoeia are those words that imitate certain sounds that naturally exist in the world. And the kind of larger property of language to do this is called iconicity. Like iconic somehow reflects the meaning. The sound reflects the meaning. And so within onomatopoeia, there are examples such as, so the most widely cited ones are animal sounds, moo. Both what the animals do and the action words, meaning verbs that we use to reflect that. So bark, oink, and now as an interesting kind of parenthetical here, though, sometimes it's funny that the sounds are not exactly the same across languages. And so, pigs in English make oink oink, but in Bulgarian they make gruch gruch. And you can relate both of these sounds to the pig, but they're not exactly the same. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And then, as you say, there are other words. There are kind of a class of onomatopoeic words that reflect sounds like plop and splash. There are another class that reflect visual kind of light effects, if I may say so, twinkle, spark. Those kinds of words are also considered onomatopoeic. And so those are supposed to be iconic, right? So there, the relationship between meaning and sound is not arbitrary. But I also wanted to point out that now more and more in specialized scientific literature is being recognized that language is a lot less arbitrary than we thought so. And another example that I wanted to point out, this is an example from English. Turns out words that have deep, round sounds like they occur in words that mean bigger things than the sounds like E, which are constrained. They don't, you close your mouth when you say an E. And so, words like tiny and like bit and, versus, like ocean and tower, even, they large. The exception, so every rule has an exception, is big and small, which are exactly the opposite. And one last point here is that iconicity is also different from sign languages, where you have, in general, there's more iconicity in sign languages than in spoken languages. So this is one part of your question. Now, whether there are words. So in general, there's this thing, and this is perhaps in European languages where people say, Italian and French sound so poetic and so musical, and languages like German sound kind of harsh. But this is tricky for various. So you would hear people say this in Europe maybe more. This is tricky for various reasons, and so. I just want to be clear that linguists want to stay away from creating we don't need more hierarchies in the world. And so kind of saying, this language is better. So this is more beautiful than this. Essentially, this language is better than this language is. And this is, perhaps, again, we don't, we want to avoid creating hierarchy. All languages are amazing in their own right. So a lot of this perception feeds with status and with familiarity. So I would say, so the short version of this is there is nothing inherently, as much as we know from research, that there's nothing inherently better or more beautiful in one versus the other. It's our ideas associated with the speakers and the country of speakers of that language, and with how familiar we are with the sounds of that language.
That's a perfect, beautiful answer. Thank you. I also, just one quick thing. I think there's like a weird hate towards German, and I think German's a very beautiful language. Like, it's got hard sounds, but it works really well.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
I completely agree.
Yeah. So, thank you so much for coming, Dr. Ivanova.
Thank you so much for having me. Great pleasure.
Thank you.